reading is from Colossians 3, 1 through 17. Therefore, if you were raised with Christ, look for the things that are above where Christ is sitting at God's right side. Think about the things above and not things on earth. You died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. So put to death the parts of your life that belong to the earth, such as sexual immorality, moral corruption, lust, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. The wrath of God is coming upon disobedient people because of these things. You used to live this way when you were alive to these things, but now set aside these things, such as anger, rage, malice, slander, and obscene language. Don't lie to each other. Take off the old human nature with its practices and put on the new nature, which is renewed in knowledge by conforming to the image of the one who created it. In this image there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all things and in all people. Therefore, as God's choice, holy and loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Be tolerant with each other, and if someone has a complaint against anyone, forgive each other. As the Lord forgave you, so also forgive each other. And over all these things put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. The peace of Christ must control your hearts, a peace into which you were called in one body. And be thankful people. The word of Christ must live in you richly. Teach and warn each other with all wisdom by singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing to God with gratitude in your hearts. Whatever you do, whether in speech or action, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus and give thanks to God the Father through him. Word of the Lord. Amen.
Our second word this evening comes from Matthew's Gospel. See if I can find it where I want it. The 5th chapter, verses 9 through 12, you'll recognize this as kind of the back half of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And this too is the word of the Lord. All right, I want to start. This is the last sermon in our Faux Pax sermon series. I want to start with a show of hands. How many of us believe that we would have participated in the civil rights movement if we were alive at the time? Marches, boycotts, sit-ins. How many think we would have participated in the civil rights movement if we were alive at the time? Probably a little more than half. Some not so sure. All right. I remember back toward the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, as that movement was beginning to receive some of its criticism, which all movements for justice do. Some folks tried to contrast it with the civil rights movement of the 60s. And so you might read a long Facebook kind of ranting post about how I definitely would have marched with King, but these Black Lives Matter protesters don't have any respect, or something like that. I heard it in my congregations, I saw it on Facebook. It was all over the place. And I remember seeing a post in response, not to anyone in particular, but in response to that whole phenomenon of trying to compare, like, yes, I definitely would have done the civil rights thing, but the Black Lives Matter thing, not so much. And the response was from a black woman pastor who was the closest thing Presbyterians have to a head of our denomination at the time. And it said simply, if you're not resisting now, then you wouldn't have resisted then either. And I was sitting in a chair by myself, reading, scrolling through Facebook on my phone or something, and I read that. And I remember it hit me like a brick in the chest. I was a good liberal, even in California. Comparatively well-versed in race and the history of racism in the United States. I'd gotten in some good trouble preaching to a white congregation during Advent, my first Advent in this church, about the sinfulness of police brutality against black men and women. But I wasn't really doing anything to challenge the systems that permit and perpetuate such violence. I wasn't out marching. I wasn't resisting now. What if it was true that I wouldn't have resisted then either? That thought terrified me. In the next year or so, Kristen and I vowed to do better. I was the president of our ecumenical ministry in town, and I organized a vigil for the victims of police brutality. We took a 3-month-old Jack at some point to a March for Our Lives rally in Sacramento. I stayed home sick while Kristen went to the Women's March, but I had totally planned to go. These were good steps, I suppose, but nothing particularly radical. And if I'm honest, I was never quite sure, even while doing them, that I believed the demonstrations would actually accomplish anything other than providing me with a slightly less feeble reason to think of myself as a good person. Now, I'm not meaning to pop anyone's optimism bubble here. This is more of a confession than anything else. I'm just saying that it was, and it is, hard for me to imagine a world that different from the world we are living in. It was hard for, and it is hard for me to imagine a world without violence, a world without prejudice, without hatred or oppression. It seems like a dream. It just doesn't seem like a reality to me. And not surprisingly, with that mindset, combined with a couple of years that have been full of very significant life transitions for my family, I have become even less engaged in the active resistance of injustice, or the way that our baptismal vow says it, which we'll get to hear next week, in the resistance of evil. I've become less active in my resistance than I used to be. What got me thinking about all of this for tonight's sermon on the peace of Christ was an article that I read this week, which was similar to our opening question that had launched my mini awakening back in 2014. Would you have participated in the civil rights movement if you were alive during that time period? But this article used the fictional nation-state thing of Gilead from A Handmaid's Tale. Handmaid's Tale watchers in here? I didn't hear that, but I'm sure it was funny. So it uses Gilead as a starting point, and the same question is essentially asked: would you be a resistor in Gilead or not? And the same point that Denise Anderson made, 7 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever it was made again. If you're not actively resisting now, that's a pretty good sign that you would not actively resist in Gilead or in any other land for that matter. But this time, the argument was made with some scientific data to back it up. A recent study that came out on human behavior and decision making. And according to this data, humans govern our behavior by some combination of two logics. The logic of consequence on the one hand, and the logic of appropriateness on the other. The logic of consequence asks, what course of action is likely to yield the most favorable outcome for me? And the logic of appropriateness asks, what is a person like me supposed to do in this situation? Logic of consequence, what's going to give me the best outcome? Logic of appropriateness, what is a person like me supposed to do in this situation? Now, both of these logics can and usually do yield a get along with the status quo decision. If I'm looking for the best outcome for me, then I'm pretty unlikely to push back against a culture that forces push back against cultural forces that are powerful enough to oppress others, right? That should be scary for me. I think it's probably not going to go well. I'll end up in some pain or in jail or something. I'm not going to do that if I'm following the logic of consequence. If I'm concerned with what a person like me is supposed to do in this situation, then there's a possibility that I'll fight the power. It's possible. But it is still more likely that my socialization into whatever culture I am in will be the loudest voice as to what is appropriate. And I will typically defer to those whom society recognizes as authorities, for instance, officers and their official decisions within the so-called criminal justice system, for instance, will almost always get the benefit of the doubt. Because that is how, in our culture, that is how white people in the U.S. train their children to treat police officers and legislators and judges and so on and so forth. So regardless of whether you're more of a logic of consequence or more of a logic of appropriateness kind of person, you're far more likely to go along with the accepted order of things, according to this study, even if that order is evil, than you are to actively resist it. Humans have a really hard time shaking the feeling that the way things are done is the right and appropriate way to do them. Only a small number, the study says, can ever be expected to rebel against the dominant order of society, even if that order is profoundly evil. But the ones who do rebel can all be expected to share one thing in common. The difference that allows us to resist, according to this set of data, is the belief in an alternative order to which we can conform our behavior against the status quo. So, if I am a logic of appropriateness kind of person, and Southern culture in the United States has told me that I'm supposed to act in XYZ way, and I don't have any alternative to that I can conjure up in my mind, then I'm going to go with XYZ. But if I have an alternative that is also telling me a different set of values and a different way to live, and I can cling to that alternative way, to that alternative order, then I have some framework within which to resist the dominant order of things. Does that make sense, generally? You may have forgotten by now because we haven't mentioned it very often, but the title of this sermon series, I guess I said at the beginning, has been Faux Pax, or Faux Pax, or whatever we want to say, false peace, referring to the Pax Romana, if you remember from the first sermon, which was declared by rulers and warriors following imperial conquest of the Roman army. The Pax Romana is the dominant order of life during the time of the Roman Empire, and it was spread around the globe by force. And when the early Christians coined the phrase that we use every week in worship, the peace of Christ be with you, they are confessing their belief and pledging their allegiance to an alternative order of things. The Pax Romana is an order of the world and how it works and who's in power and who's underneath power. The peace of Christ is an alternative which allows those early Christians to resist what is effectively an evil or oppressive status quo. The peace of Christ, which we might think of as being this fluffy thing, is actually quite combative. It is a peace against. It's a peace which can never be taken for granted, but must be forged in the fires, even if they be the fires of hell. Haley spoke in her sermons about a gun buyback program that was modeled on Isaiah's vision of the day of the Lord, in which weapons of war and destruction are beaten into farming tools, which bring forth from creation the very stuff of life and growth. She spoke of a playground built at the site of the border wall between the United States and Mexico, and even more poignantly of a communion table and a communion service that is shared across this wall, actively and intentionally countering the divisive effects of that big giant piece of metal that divides people on a made-up barrier. Peace in this world, if it is to be true peace, has to be made. Blessed are the peacemakers. Notice Jesus does not say, blessed are the peacekeepers, as if peace were the natural state of things, and our job is simply to not disrupt it. Peacemakers implies that the natural state of things, the status quo, is actually quite void of anything resembling true peace, absent our purposefully, maybe even defiantly, waging it, forging it, making it. That's the reality into which Paul, or whoever writes Colossians, is writing in that letter. And it is the reason behind all of those strange claims and lists that he includes. He and the Christians in this town are in the process of constructing an alternative order of things that's not based on earthly hierarchies or traditions or popular sentiments, but is based on Christ. You died, Paul says. What a strange way to start. And your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, remember, your career is not your life. Your grades are not your life. Your followers and likes on Instagram are not your life. Your being liked or accepted by these very important people is not your life. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, you will be revealed with him in glory. Since that old you died, make sure that you put to death with it all of the materialism and objectifying and selfishness and plain old greed of that old order that you used to conform to. That's precisely the stuff that Christ's peace is coming against. Y'all may have noticed it because it's a word that we hate. Wrath is actually the word he uses there, and we don't tend to like that word. But reframe the wrath of God for just a minute. Just a little experiment with me. Reframe the wrath of God as God's sovereign love manifest in God's divine opposition to injustice, God's opposition to violence, God's opposition to oppression, and suddenly the wrath of God can start to seem downright peacemaking. Take off the old way that you learned to be human, because we're all socialized into this culture that says XYZ, remember. And put on Christ's way. Let go of those categories that we use to separate people from one another. Christ is all things. Christ is in all people. Categories be damned. When you start making Christ the dominant order for your life, and Paul gives some examples of what this looks like: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, and love. Is that what we primarily see coming out of the church these days? Seems to be what this letter thinks those of us who claim Christ as our peace should be. When Christ becomes our dominant order, then the peace of Christ is ruling in your hearts, and the Pax Romana is not. Christ is our alternative order. He is peace which invades and overcomes violence, justice which invades and overcomes injustice, life which invades and overcomes death. As we said in the opening sermon of this series, to believe in him is to get caught up in an uprising against the disorder of the world. Now, I want to contend as we wrap up this series that it is for this reason that the biblical authors make such a big stink over this thing that we call belief. It's not about getting yourself into heaven or hell when you die. But if we can't imagine an alternative to false peace, to the disorder of this world, then we're destined to tolerate it as inevitable until we accept it as neutral, until we celebrate it as good, until finally we promote it as if it is the truth. I think that's what biblical authors are thinking about when they say it's so important that you believe in Christ because the alternative is the status quo. And we all know that's not good for most people. After Jesus blesses the peacemakers, just in case we needed more confirmation that peacemakers are not the same as peacekeepers, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed are you peacemakers. Now, just, you're probably going to be persecuted. You're blessed too, don't worry, you're still blessed. Rejoice. Oh, blessed are you when people revile you and say nasty things about you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you. And of course, we all know in the same way they will go on to persecute Jesus himself this way. It is the keenest irony that biblical peacemakers rarely live peaceful lives and rarely die peaceful deaths, at least not in the common sense of the word peace. But the foremost among them is raised in glory. That's the catch in our story. The Prince of Peace, unjustly executed by the state, rises up against the disorder of the world. By his faithfulness, by his belief in an alternative which was so pure that he himself became the alternative, the whole world gets transformed. May we have such faith in Christ that we too, as individuals and as a community of faith, the Presbyterian Student Center at the University of Georgia and beyond it in Athens, may we too have such faith that we become the alternative to a world of false peace. Friends, the peace of Christ be with you, and the peace of Christ become you, until Christ is all and in all. Amen.